this, and everybody write this down, because this is all very simple and very important, and probably each and every one on the meeting right now has this problem. We have a Canadian contingent, several new Canadians in the group, including John here. Welcome, John. And John, you sent me some great stats and details over the holidays as well, so we'll go through that, not today, but quickly here. But we have a lot of new schools and a lot of people who are still at a price point that is more reminiscent of the 70s or the 80s rather than today. And frankly, we get a lot of kind of new people coming in who are charging same or less that I was charging 40 years ago. Our 40-year anniversary was May 6, 1983. And if I were to go back and look at the price sheet that I had in 1983, we have a lot of people who are charging less than that now. And so the point number one is pricing. And let me, Ben, relative to your statement there, is when I moved to Denver, this is would be 41 years ago this March. I did go through and I shopped all the competition. Nobody knew who I was in Denver, so I went and took introductory classes and let them try to pitch me and enroll me. And I looked at, back then, their Yellow Pages ads, any other ads that I could come up with. There wasn't much to find there, and looked at their schools and their locations. And after I sat down and analyzed what they were doing in one thing or another, I decided that all that time and effort was irrelevant, and just opened the school basically using the Junior Institute price sheet that was being used in Washington, D.C., which put me at double the next highest priced school in the metro area. And within about 2 years, I had arguably 60 or 70% of the, if you're going to use market share in the Denver metro area. And by the way, there were a lot of schools then. There was, I think the last time I looked at the Yellow Pages, it said 380. Probably back then it was 300 or so schools in the area, which meant I had as many students or more in my organization as everybody else put together, plus probably 10 or 20%. And of course, they all immediately hated me. Number one, they didn't know me, and they didn't know my martial arts background particularly, and they dubbed me the business guy, and a McDojo and a belt factory and every other thing, which is totally irrelevant. I mean, who cares what your competition thinks? But the other element of it is the point of the whole matter was we very rarely got anybody who came in and price shopped. And if they do price shop, what we know is, and this goes back to Cialdini's research, Influence, Science, and Practice, we know if somebody price shops, you don't want to be middle of the road. You don't want to be just a little bit more expensive than everybody else. You want to be a lot more expensive than everybody else, because the way the mind works is, absent other objective criteria, price determines perception of value. So number one is pretty much everybody is underpricing where you should be. And if you needed an excuse, we're in the weirdest economic times that I can remember. You have to go back to Jimmy Carter to find anything comparable. And I predicted long before the last election that this administration would be a replication of Jimmy Carter. In some ways, it's been worse. In some ways, it's been better. We've never gotten the interest rates as high as it was during Carter, or 21% mortgage rates and all that kind of craziness. But the hangover from COVID has created, a high inflation rate. If you ever need an excuse to raise your prices, everybody else with any kind of service is raising their prices, and the only exception to that are bubbles that imploded due to price change. So, Teslas are reducing their prices. The new Corvette, when it came out, was inflated 50% over MSRP, and now you can buy them at list, and so forth. But other than weird bubbles like that, what you've seen is a strange economy. And by the way, if you did well, yes, last year, anywhere in the U.S. and Canada, you lived through one of the weirdest economic times. The last 3 years are one of the weirdest economic times that I've ever seen in our industry. So, you should pat yourself on the back for if you did well of coming through that as unscathed as you came. I don't say that very often because I hate to have people have an excuse, but if your numbers were way up last year, you were way up in a weird economic environment without exception. So our point number one, the three things that we always cover on these meetings are pricing for new students, the ratio, improving the ratio from lead to enrollment, and then opening the floodgates, at least getting a partial Parthenon going in so you get enough traffic. The one thing that you should mark on your checklist is raise the prices way more than you're comfortable with for new enrollments. And what I've said several times already is I would love to see everybody here be the US equivalent of $397 a month, and also the US equivalent of at least 500 initially plus the first month. So that'd be $897 to enroll. Now, if that's too far out of your way of rationalizing for yourself, then figure out what you can get yourself to do and make that next jump, and then start making jumps more frequently. I've had friends who did real well who, every 20 enrollments, they raise the price $10 a month. I don't particularly like that approach, but that's fine. Master Smith, and working with a lot of you who have a hard time getting your mind around this, adopted normally the tuition's $297 a month. And, if you go ahead and enroll now, it's $247 a month. And the only rationale for doing it that way really was to get who's ever doing the enrollment used to presenting it that way. And then when they change and go to 347 and present 297, you're conditioning them to the next level. Does that make sense to everybody? So number one is get your new enrollment pricing way higher than you're comfortable with, and start the new year off with a higher price point. And the biggest mistake we've seen with new people we brought on board is they wait till they've enrolled 100 more students at their own price point before they get the gist, right? And Master Moody, I wasn't in the room when you did this, but if you took all the $1 million a year schools and plus and said, what's your one biggest regret that you had if you look back 4 or 5 years, Master Moody, what was their biggest regret?
Yeah, that they hadn't raised the prices soon enough.
Yeah, yeah. They were too timid and too slow in raising their tuition. So,
And I had a meeting with Sean McFadden from Canada this morning, and he had already raised his prices now to $397. And now that you said it, I forgot to ask whether that was Canadian or US, but he is charging $397, and that might be Canadian, which is would be the equivalent of $297 US. And he said it had no effect. He was getting the same amount of enrollments. It didn't hinder anything.
yeah, and the point is, and I see a fair number of staff on the meeting. School owners tell us that the staff always push back on pricing, assuming that nobody's going to be able to afford that. Well, number one is that's just not true. And number two is, if you role play it appropriately, the point at which when you raise the price, you have a problem is if you're incongruent, whoever's doing the enrollment presentation, if you're incongruent presenting it, which gives the perception that you think it's too expensive, then you're going to have a conversion problem. But is it true that you get some percentage of people who come in for your introductory process who can't afford your tuition? Absolutely. And it doesn't matter whether you're charging $89 a month, $189 a month, $289 a month, or $397 a month, you still get a percentage that come in and they can't afford it. What happens when you raise the price and you're unsure about it is you start hearing that the reason why nobody is enrolling is because they can't afford it. Well, I have to remind you, ultimately it comes down, there's only two reasons people don't enroll: time or money. Time, they can't come twice a week. Time, they're not willing to commit to a year enrollment. Or money, whatever you're asking for, isn't in the budget. And frankly, if you get too many people where you believe them, where they're truly broke, that's a marketing problem, not a tuition problem. it means you're fishing in the wrong pond. So again, I won't continue on this, but let's start with number one for the new year. Get your prices at a point where they're uncomfortable for you, and tell the staff to sit down, shut up, and just do what you tell them to do. And by the way, that's the thing that you should also be doing on these Thursday meetings. These Thursday meetings, you should have your staff engaged in this. And Master Smith and I were just laughing about, between Junery Institute, World Champion Jeff Smith Karate, Mile High Karate before they were franchised, and the franchises. I figured that I had now run, I don't know, something like 150 staff meetings a year for 30 years. So you can run that number, not including Junery Institute or anything else. And I never had a staff person beg me to get more training. I never had a staff member excited about, coming to our business meeting. I never had a staff member excited about going through stats. They always complained about every book I ever gave them, no matter how much they enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it after the fact. If I had a choice of, we're going to read a book a week or we're going to read a book a year, they would choose once a year. It doesn't matter what their feedback is on training. What matters is that you train them, you get them engaged, and you get them to that level. And taking their feedback on whether they enjoy a Zoom meeting or enjoy an in-person meeting or enjoy a particular book is a fool's errand. So just don't ask, right? Just,
Follow that up with your comment from some of your staff who went off into another field, and 4 or 5 years later you ran into them.
No, it well, surprisingly, and most of these aren't. I ran into them. I had any number of staff members, a big number over the years. I'd hear from them a year later, or 5 years later, or 6 years later, and they want to take me out to lunch, and just be so thankful about all the training that they received going into whatever career they went into. I had one who went into a sales role, and was immediately learned that he had read more on management, development, sales than their director of sales and their director of operations. I had another one who went into a very big company. He went into their management training program, and he was already better trained than any of their management trainees when they got done with it. And I could go on and on and on. Yeah, it's not unusual for them to leave, oftentimes leave in a huff, annoyed with all the stuff that they were having to do. And then 2, 3, 5, 6 years later, come back and just praise all the training they went through and how it dramatically impacted their growth. Yeah, Matt Smith, I had that a lot.
I either have that or I have them bitching about their new job isn't as organized or well run.
Yeah, that too. Anyway, so number one, any questions about pricing? We could spend a lot of time on it, but I want to cover a lot of ground today, and I have a pretty firm agenda to kick off the start of the year.
I have
Quick
one,
questions about
Go ahead.
pricing.
Go ahead, John.
one quick question is, I don't know if I brought this up before, but I've heard some schools are paying or charging like bi-weekly.
Yeah.
And, it seems to help them, I don't know, I guess get their rates up, but it's perceived as being less money, but
Yeah, I don't like that. I will, number one, on the perception of less money, I would much rather spend all my time on creating the perception of high value than to worry about the, them perceiving, the amount of tuition one way or the other. So what the every 2-week thing, what it is, here's my brutal take on it, is it's a way of fooling people into paying for 13 months for 12 months of lessons. Because what happens is, in my view, the first time they get charged 3 times in a month is it feels to them like they got overcharged. Now, I've had the debate with several other people, and I don't know, John, and maybe in your area of Canada, are people familiar with paying for things by every fortnight? Is that a thing?
question.
That was a question.
Yeah.
what, yeah, so I
Every 2 weeks.
Yep. Well, do people use that terminology? You know, I pay for my rent every every fortnight.
Well, our mortgage, for example, I do it biweekly.
Yeah.
Just because I
That's
wanna
used.
pay it off faster, right? So,
Well, yeah, that's the point, is when you pay your mortgage bi-weekly, you pay 13 months.
yeah,
So, you know, if you whether you paid an extra month once a year, or whether you pay it every 2 weeks, and 2 months a year, you pay 3 times, right? My take on it is, I feel like unless they come to it looking at it in the world, and all this came from Australia. You know, schools in Australia started charging per fortnight, and EFC and other groups in the US started hearing about that, and then somebody went, wow, that means I get 13 months, not 12 months. um, I don't view it in the US and Canada as ethical, just because I think people don't understand it.
Well, and the mistake I think people make, Master Oliver, too, is that if they were going to charge $300 a month, they charge less for the bi-weekly than 150. If you're going to do that, the strategy would be to charge 150 every 2 weeks, and then you get the extra 300 in the payment, but they'll charge 115 or something, or 120. It just messes the whole thing up. It's not, I don't, the advantage, I don't think we've seen anybody have a higher close rate. That would be the advantage if it's to that point. I don't think we've seen anybody have a higher close rate because they did bi-weekly than if they did monthly at just the regular full rate.
okay.
There's no
Yeah,
evidence. There's no evidence that we've seen that anybody does better with that.
yeah, that's the bottom line. And yeah, I had this came to mind recently. Master Moody, you weren't there. I know Master Smith was there, but we had Bill Glazier and Dan Kennedy and a couple of other people of similar ilk down in Florida early on when I took over NAPNA, and we were having this conversation, and their data was showing that the more often somebody saw, and by the way, they had a big membership base. They had probably 25,000 members at the time. Is they were tracking back that the more charges somebody was getting on their card each month, and the argument came up because, I was doing the upgrade program for NAPNA at the time, and they were billing it separate hits, and I was always saying it should just be one charge, and but their conclusion was, in their business, the more times somebody saw their credit card hit per month, is it spiked cancellations. And so that's an argument for the opposite. They were actually looking at how do they bill people every other month or something like that for a low level membership. And in doing product sales and one thing or another, they were wanting to do one big charge rather than multiple small charges, for the reason that they were seeing multiple charges spiking their cancellation rate. I just thought about that recently, but we had an hour and a half conversation about that back then, and they had data to support the encouraging the cancellation rate with more charges, which is also why I don't like nickel and diming people to death. I don't want to charge them for mouthpieces, pads, the uniform. I want it to all be bundled in, because the more times they feel like they get hit, the worse. A story I've told a number of times, but it bears repeating. The worst I ever saw is we were at a school in Fort Lauderdale. I forget the owner's name, but it was a Korean-run school, and we had a big group of us down there, and we're watching a class, and all of a sudden, all the kids come running out like this to mom. And what it was is it was board breaking day, and the owner took us back, showed us his back room, and he had a saw and one thing or another, and very proudly told us how much he was buying the boards for, and he was how much he was selling the boards for, and he was making, I forget what it was, $2,000 or $3,000 a month selling the boards. All I saw was 30 kids. I saw at least 5, if not more, moms look annoyed, digging through their purse looking for dollar bills. I saw at least 3 of them annoyed, going up to the counter and getting a credit card out, saying, I don't have any cash on me. Can I pay for the boards with a credit card? And I saw 2 kids over in the corner crying because mom and dad wasn't there. They didn't have any money and they couldn't break the boards for board breaking day. And so he was very proud of the amount of money he was making every month through, charging them for breaking boards. I was calculating in my head quickly, what's their drop? How are they spiking their dropout rate? How are they reducing their renewal rate? How are they creating other problems with this thing that's to me, that was the ultimate nickel and diming I've ever seen. But a lot of us do that with, you enroll and it's $10 for the school patch and it's $5 for this and it's, $20 for this. Then you need this package and it's X amount of money. I'd rather get rid of all that stuff and ask them for money as rarely as possible. And anytime you're asking for money, have it bundled, which I think is the other side of that question, John, is rather than charging them more often, I'd rather charge them less often.
I just add something to that, Master Oliver. The other
Yeah.
thing, it's less brain damage on us if we charge them less often.
Mhm.
So including the gear, including that stuff, not, just giving it to them, it's less chance of employees stealing from us. It's less chance of other stuff. So that's another, I just wanted to add that because I know you like those benefits too.
Oh yeah. Well, Jan, this has been a few years ago now, but she was doing the daycare thing and people would come in and pay across the desk weekly. And she found out that she had, what was it, Masterman? You may remember the right number.
$80,000.
Yeah. I was going to say 90, but $80,000 embezzled. I had another friend that was doing a similar thing, and what was happening is his receptionist knew the code for the credit card machine, and every day was going in and running credits on the machine, which basically just takes money out of your account and puts it into their account. And he wasn't paying attention enough to notice that, by his words, that she had embezzled a Lotus Esprit before he figured it out. So that was his dream car, a Lotus Esprit. I didn't want to try to shoehorn myself into one, to tell you the truth. But okay.
Huh.
Any other questions on pricing?
Yeah, can I ask?
I have a question, sir.
Oh, okay, go.
Whoever's first. Jack, Krista, then Jack.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about the initial tuition. It's the only thing that I ever get feedback on, and what I usually say is, oh, that's how this tuition is structured, and that limits it. I had a student recently who just was hemming and hawing about it. He doesn't want to do it because he's got his daughter in $400 piano lessons and he doesn't want to do another payment. He wrote to me recently. He said, I'll do it if you waive the registration fee, which I don't call it the registration fee. How would you handle that one?
Well, when you say feedback, I'll tell you what is fairly common. What's fairly common is somebody will, when you get to the closing question, they'll say, well, I was fine with the monthly payment, but I just, I don't know about the, $897. And when you break it down, you say, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't get paid till whatever it is, the first. So you're saying that's tight for the budget. Oh yeah. Okay. Well, what'll work for the budget? Well, I could do the $397. I just can't do the other $500. Okay, fine. And so then what you do is have them pay the $397. And then I'll come back when we do the agreement and say, when's good for the other $500? Oftentimes they'll say, well, I can't do that till the first. Okay. And I'll ask them I'll always ask them one more question. Does the 500 and the first month work for you on the first? And sometimes they say no. And I say, okay, no problem. We'll just push that off a month. That to me is the more common pushback, Krista, is you do get people who just, they can't come up with the initial tuition, but it's an easy back off to let them basically pay what they say they can pay and then break it up from there. On your particular question, that they're making they'll enroll. I'm not sure I follow. They want to pay in full for the year. They want to pay monthly.
They want to pay monthly, and they'll enroll if we waive the initial tuition, the registration fee, as he's calling it.
Yeah. And this is somebody you did the enrollment with. They left and then they came back.
We did an enrollment conference with them. They said no. They said they're not going to do it because the daughter is in piano lessons and he's already spending enough money on that. He doesn't want to do more. And then he wrote to me and said, actually, yes, I want to do it if you waive the initial tuition.
Okay, well, in practical terms, what I would do is I would bring them in for another class and then have a chat. The my take on it though is probably different than what some other people might say. My take on it is if somebody proves himself to be a pain in the ass on the way in the door, they're probably going to be a pain in the ass forever. And that doesn't mean I don't want to enroll anybody I can enroll. I just wouldn't get into negotiating price. Now, if you get them back into class, the way I would handle it is say, well, that's built into the tuition. If you want to just prepay the year, then we waive that initial tuition. You're welcome to do that. You said you didn't want another monthly payment anyway. So that's a way to reframe it for them.
But don't ever do it by email back.
No. But you see, did you catch what he was saying? That you'll waive that if they prepay the year. See, that doesn't mean we're going to give them another 10 or 20% off. It's kind of like they're saving the initial by prepaying the year.
Right.
And they could put that on a Visa or MasterCard and then pay their card back monthly if they prefer that.
Yeah. But the underlying principle is you don't want to get into negotiating price. Right. And so if we were face to face with them, what I would say is, Ms. Jones, the tuition is the tuition. Are you saying that doesn't work for the budget? You can't afford to do that. And frankly, people, the wealthier they are, the more likely they are to negotiate price.
Yeah.
And so what I often find is if I frame it back to them of, oh, you just can't afford it. Oftentimes I go, well, no, of course I could afford it. Oh, okay. Well, how did you want to do that? Did you want to do Visa, MasterCard, check, cash? What's the best way to do that? And oftentimes that solves the problem with somebody who's, drove up in the Porsche with a Rolex and is trying to negotiate price. On the flip side, I'm not going to start the relationship with giving in on a demand. Because guess what? When you come to the renewal, any little thing goes sideways. And the reality is we should all have enough traffic coming in that you want people who are going to be a good fit with the school and are going to be delighted to be there. You don't want to get, sucked into things like that.
And I've had that situation before, Krista, where it was the exact same situation where they didn't want to pay a down payment or registration fee or whatever you were calling it. And I said, okay, then if you want to prepay the year, then I can waive that for you. And that's all they wanted. They felt like they won then. Oh, okay, here's my card. And there was no balk on it. It was almost like, okay, they just wanted something special that you're giving them. And you gave them a way to get that without really compromising your pricing because, sometimes we give 10 or 20% off for paying it in full anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the reframe. Go ahead, John.
Has anybody what we've tended to do for that sort of thing is we do offer them to pay that installment over the next 3 months, something like that. So we'll break up that $500 into 3 payments, and then that helps them out. So they're basically feeling like they've been helped out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
I was going to say the difference is some don't get phased when people want to try to negotiate. We just don't negotiate. It's some of the people just want to. John's question's different.
Yeah.
John, you're right, because they're still paying it. It's just how they pay it, and it's okay.
Well, but what I was going to say, John, is from a sales training standpoint and developing staff at your level, is what you want to do is get your staff to be good at asking questions and listening to the answer, as opposed to making propositions that don't necessarily address what the underlying issue is. So oftentimes what I would hear with staff that weren't all that good is somebody says, oh, I can't pay that. Or they'd hear some other iteration of, I don't want to pay that. And they didn't know does this mean that I cannot, possibly give you a credit card or write a check and do it? Or does this mean I just don't think I should? And so now I'm negotiating price. And if it's the latter, breaking it up in 3 payments doesn't solve that problem. If it's the former, what would work for you now? And oftentimes the answer surprises you. Well, I could do 600. I can't do 897. Oh, okay, fine. No problem. Well, I couldn't do more than $100 a day until I get paid on the first. Oh, okay. No problem. We do take credit cards if you want to put, well, I've only got a debit card. Okay. So on either end of the spectrum, right? If somebody just gives me $100 a day and we finalize the enrollment, we've got a commitment to pay it later. I'm not thrilled, but I'm gonna do it. And if somebody gives me, all but $50, I'm gonna do it. And I'd rather just ask the question, see where they're coming from. And to me, the hardest thing in staff training over the years with, hundreds, if not thousands of staff members over the years, is get them to ask questions and listen to the answer rather than just keep talking all the time, right? You want staff, well, and yourself, but you want anybody in a sales role to learn that talking doesn't make the sale, listening makes the sale, right? So,
In
yeah,
in that specifically, sir, I think what you did really well there was you asked a question about what they could do,
Yeah.
rather than, I think the thing we slip up in is go, well, can you split it up into 3 payments? Can you do 2 payments? Or making suggestions like that, you're very likely not going to make the right suggestion. Whereas if you ask them and they give you some whatever, then you go, yes, now they can't say no.
yeah, or I'd have staff just say, well, why don't we divide by 12 and we just throw it into the monthly tuition, and then they create another problem for themselves, and it goes down the wrong angle. Okay, Jack, you had a quick question, and then we'll move on.
Yes, everything you say, I agree with. I like that it shows a higher perception of value. I like that you don't nickel and dime, you include everything in. I guess where I struggle a little bit is, and maybe others do too, I don't know, is, well, we didn't raise value. We raised price, but we didn't raise. Now I know there's a perception of value, but we actually literally, so in our conscience, we feel a little bit like, are we just overcharging them now? Is that so I don't know if you could deal with that a little bit. And where I'm
Mr. Clay
where my
has an
thinking
answer
is
for
wrong.
that one for you, Jack.
Well,
What's that?
Go ahead, Mr. Clay.
Thank you, guys. Hi, everyone. I think we all have a price point and a value point that we're growing to. So with you adding more to your program, it's not that you're overcharging, but you're just getting to what you're worth. And the more money you have coming in, the more resources you can give, whether it be books, different equipment. But I don't think we're trying to compensate our value. I think everyone's just rising the bar to their true value because you are worth that much, if that makes sense.
Good
Yeah.
explanation.
Could I add to that, please?
go ahead.
Well, that question was posed to me by my staff, not what the other guys were charging, but what are we going to do to deserve more? Because my guys were trained that, to serve, deserves means from service. So, the biggest thing was following the wealth system, right? Implementing, slowly but surely, but really getting, I look back at 3 years ago when I just started, it's been 3 years. And there's no comparison to, the black belt verbiage, the character sheets, the vision sheets, the whole renewal process, them, doing the the essays, the video testimonials, so it's the old adage, if you want more, you have to be more.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I would argue that point slightly differently, Jack, from 2 angles, right? It's a different conversation with what you're going to do with your current students versus what you're going to do with the next person in the door, right? And if you can ever look at the next group of black belts you promote and look at them, have conversations about what they've attained, have conversations about the changes in their life, the changes in their environment, the changes in their development. If you can ever have that conversation with black belts you've developed and feel like you overcharge them, then yeah, you have a problem, right? I've never had a conversation with one of the black belts we've developed that wouldn't have paid 100 times what we charged them if they fully and well, one, if they could, and two, if they truly and emotionally felt and believed that they would feel the way they felt and have accomplished what they've accomplished by the time they got to black belt. And so that having been said, the mistake that people will make is say, we need to dramatically improve our program before we raise the price. So I'm jumping on what you're itching to say, Master Moody, but you don't need to change anything before you raise the price for the next person in the door. If your sales ratios are weak, then, and I would say we do this regardless, but we need to create a higher perception of value. Sometimes that's improving who's teaching the introductory class, what they're teaching, how it's doing. I come at it from a multi-school standpoint, so I like tools. So CDs or videos, booklets, brochures, etc. But what I'd like to do is have tools and people who create a higher level perception of value. If my ratios are weak, certainly that's the first thing I would do to go about fixing it, right? What I very rarely have ever gotten, and I don't know how many thousands of enrollments I've done belly to belly, face to face over the years. I don't think I've ever gotten somebody who says to me, wow, you're charging way too much for what you're providing. I've gotten a lot, probably hundreds over the years who just couldn't afford it. That's fine. But and usually with them, it's like, oh my goodness, this is worth 3 or 4 times what you're asking. I just don't know how we're going to fit in the budget right now because my husband lost his job for the last 3 months, or whatever the reason is. But you really, if you do a halfway decent job, both with tools and with the class, you really shouldn't have anybody who says this is too much for what you're providing. And you shouldn't feel that way if when you talk to your black belts, if they don't look back and find it, way more valuable than anything that you ever thought about charging. Does that make sense, Jack?
Does. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And what Gustavo said was right on. I mean, keep, dramatically, mostly on developmental, keep improving the value of your program. And tomorrow with exactly the same program that you have, just start charging the next new person in the door a lot more. Right. Okay. Any last question about price? Okay. Point number 2 is we still do see some schools who aren't doing a good job at keeping their stats. But and I already addressed this point in many ways in that last conversation, but you've got to really be tracking your lead to appointment to intro to enrollment ratios and constantly benchmarking and improving those numbers. Here is the problem is if you go from having relatively low lead flow to relatively high lead flow, the first problem tends to be the ratios fall apart. The second thing that happens is it's really easy to take your eye off that ball. And I'm going to do some walk through some stats with everybody today if we get to it here. But what's the example is a school that took their eye off the ball of lead to appointment and a school that took their eye off the ball of intro to enrollment. And their average number was 10 enrollments a month, when if they had been doing a halfway decent job at the intro process, they would have been doing 20 or 25 enrollments a month. And I mean, it's a school that's doing, what did they do, Master Smith? 700,000 last year. So it's, it's not a tiny school, not a $1 million school yet, but they just took the eye off the ball of the intro process and started iterating, different things that they were doing in the intro process, which turned out to create the ratios badly. So issue number 2 is make sure that you're really good at paying attention to your numbers. And every day and every week, always be looking at your month to date and quarter to date numbers and tracking how are we doing? Are we starting to lose people who didn't show up for the intro? Are we getting a bunch of leads in all of a sudden, but we're not doing a good job converting to appointment? Be looking at those numbers. So point number 2 is really get on top of your numbers. What we're going to do over the next few weeks is go back to basics on incoming call, outbound lead call, intro process, enrollment process, and so forth. All of stuff that if you have staff doing this, they should be on there. But we've got to make sure we're tracking those numbers and getting a really good conversion rate. I know from looking at numbers, there's at least 5 or 6 of you on the call where if you just were good at your conversion rates, you would have double the number of enrollments that you have now, right? And then the second thing is if you got really good at fixing your dropout rates, frankly, you wouldn't need to double the enrollments. You'd have plenty of students regardless of where you're at. But that's number 2 is really make a commitment to be keeping really good stats. And we're going to go through some here in a minute, but be keeping really good stats and be paying attention to it. Any thoughts or questions on that?
I just had that same conversation with one of our members before this meeting today. It was
Yeah.
on conversion percentages. And we started addressing, you have to take each one individually and figure out what you're doing wrong. Why aren't you hitting those percentages? And maybe you should just give them, not everybody has those numbers memorized on what percentages that they should be at, so you know. And that's why I like to use 100 as the amount of leads you need each month, because if you get 100 leads, that should generate 20 to 30 enrollments. So if we take it from the top, that lead to appointment should be about 80%. Some people do 90, some do 60, depending on where it comes from. So it should all average out to at least 80%. And of those 80% who make an appointment, we should have at least 50 to 60% show up. Well, if 50 to 60% of 80 show up, then we're going to have on that 40 to 50 people come in and take a first intro. And then where some schools and this one that I was talking to had a 50% drop off from first to second. Well, if he just fixed that, because 95% of the people who take first should be back to the second, regardless of where they came from. So you should have, almost 100%. And the reason for that is because you said something wrong on that first intro when you were rescheduling them for their second class, or you didn't teach a good first intro. So you have to look at what you're doing to find out what the problem is. We're not at your school, so we can't see it, but that's why we've told everybody, and Master Moody even put up a couple sources to get these video cameras that cost hardly anything these days in your classrooms. So you can have those things recorded, and then you can share that with us, and we can look at your intro, or we can look at the intro rescheduling for the next class to see if you're doing or saying something wrong that is causing those percentages. So again, I'll run down them. 100 to 80% to 50 or 60% are going to show up. And again, those could be higher or lower depending on their source. And then out of the ones who show up for first, 95 come back for the second. So now we have 45 that are back for the second. And out of those, we should be closing at least 50 to 60%. That's not a high number, 60%. So now you're in that 20 to 30 range of 100 leads. Now, some months somebody will get a bunch of leads from one source, and they're putting all their eggs in one basket. That's why, as Master Oliver has been preaching to you guys, make sure your marketing source is coming from all
and Master Smith, that's our next topic. So You know, on before we get into that topic is, John, you made a really good point before the holidays. Really, the objective of your school should be, and you've got to make a decision. I mean, there are some of you who may want to grow a school to 600 or 800 students. Master Smith, Master Moody, and I have all been at that point. I tend to think that 300 students at an average revenue of $400 or $500 a month each is the lowest brain damage, highest profitable way to do it. But you know, you have to make a decision when you get to around 300. Do I want to turn this into 600 students, or do I want to kind of cap it there and keep raising my prices and keep improving my retention? But John, the point you made is right. If your retention is where it should be, you really don't need to be great at marketing. One of my old friends that I use as an example all the time is Buzz Durkin. Buzz was always horrible at marketing, absolutely horrible. He still has a website that he put up, you know, I don't know, probably in 1999 or something like that. Doesn't do lead capture, doesn't do anything at all. They're just horrible at marketing, but they never lose a student practically. Last time I actually did the computations on his dropout rate, because he didn't do the computations, it was 0.7% a month loss. Well, they're losing less than 1%. So if you have 300 people, and occasionally you get the grandkid, you get the new child, you get the buddy referral, they only need 2 or 3 people a month to stay even. And so they can run a beautiful school, not be having to worry about marketing in any way, shape, or form. See, I think the ultimate objective for everybody is to get so good at student retention that you're doing what Buzz does, which is in the afternoon, he has a class of 4th degree black belts that's 32 people. Well, that's a much better situation to be in than to constantly be a hamster on the wheel searching for new people, right? And Master Smith, as you were talking about the first intro, we'll go in through and diagnose all that stuff next couple of weeks. But I've seen people whose first intro to second intro ratio is crappy because the school has a bad first impression, the windows are dirty, there's handprints on the front door, and they hired high talent assholes as staff members who left people waiting for 10 minutes before they talked to them, right? So, you know, it's not always that you said the wrong thing. Oftentimes it's just that you have people with poor people skills, or you haven't done a good job of staging it, or you have the previous class going on, somebody gets knocked out, or you know, they're out there twirling knives or something. There's all kinds of things you can do to screw up the introductory process.
You only have one chance to make a first impression, so
Yeah, that's right.
it's important that
Let's-
you and the school looks appropriate.
Yeah, let's go to our next subject. It's one that anybody who's been with us for a while is tired of hearing, and I almost very rarely see anybody who really are doing it.